Now, for more on this, let's bring in Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang, who is all too familiar with this. And Gordon, as Steve just pointed out, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, decides his first flight is right down there to Panama City, to the Panama Canal. And as we pointed out with Steve, Gordon, you have this very important canal, one of the busiest waterways in the world, but on both ends, in Balboa and in Cristobal, you have Chinese companies, holding companies that own those ports. How much of a concern of Chinese influence is this, and what do you make of the fact that the new Trump administration is so intent on engaging here?
This is absolutely critical because China can shut down the canal at will. And it could do so through those two port operations at both ends of the canal, as you point out, because they are run by Hutchison, which is a Hong Kong company, but in China's system, they cannot ignore or disobey an order from the party. But also we have other Chinese enterprises in the zone. And just to give you an example, China is now building the fourth bridge over the Panama Canal. Right now, they're just abutments in the water, but in a year and a half from now, there will be steel over the waterway. China can bring that bridge down. And we know what can happen because in March in Baltimore, when a ship hit the pier of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, it closed the port of Baltimore. Well, China can do the same thing in any number of different ways.
Well, and Gordon, obviously, we talked about the two ports in the Panama Canal, but to your point, for our viewers, let's broaden it a little bit. Look at all of these ports, key places down Africa. You've got the Suez Canal, you've got European, you've got the English Channel, the Singapore Straits, a number of ports controlled or owned by the Chinese. And this began decades ago, the maritime Silk Road, as some have referred to it. Were we not paying attention? And is this something that the Trump administration is now able to catch up to, or are we too far behind?
Well, we weren't paying attention. It's never too late to do something. But, you know, in our own hemisphere, we have Chinese ports all throughout South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And one of them is within 87 miles of the Florida East Coast. That's in Freeport in the Bahamas. And China, of course, has extensive operations in Cuba, which are mostly military. So we have a region which is closer to China than it is to the United States. We saw that when Biden was humiliated when he went to Peru last year. So really, this is the first time that we've had a president who is focused on diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere. And that's a really good thing because these threats are critical.
Well, and to your point for our viewers, so Cuba here, and you're talking about the influence of China, that, of course, now the Gulf of America, Exxon in their shareholder newsletter referred to it as that, perhaps time to change. But, you know, you talk about really the entire, not just Panama, but from Colombia all the way up through Central America, there is a number of Chinese-controlled entities there that may cause problems. How successful will the administration, should the administration expect to be in trying to wean off some of that influence?
I think that Trump, well, first of all, Mexico, Canada, countries in the region have taken us for granted. And Trump, who is willing to use American power and exert leverage, can change this. This will be a long-term process, but we can do it, especially because ultimately these countries depend more on us than they do on China. Although China has extensive trade relations with them, those are easy to change. And so for a long time, you know, we have just ignored what we call our backyard. And China right now has extensive operations throughout it.
I just want to take you to one other place, Gordon, and that's this. Here in this area, this is the Darien Gap, the dangerous space between Colombia and Panama. I've gone through there at the height of the border crisis during the Biden administration. Thousands come through, many from places like Venezuela, South America, but also known terrorists. Do you suspect that part of the Trump administration's intent of sending Rubio to Panama on the first trip may also involve some of tapping down that gateway of the global migrant flow that comes through that dangerous Darien Gap.
Yeah, absolutely. The Biden administration built infrastructure to facilitate migrant flows through the Darien Gap, especially the San Vicente camp in Panama at the north end of the gap. By the way, the Trump administration is no longer going to fund that. And more important, we got to remember that war correspondent Michael Yan, who's now in Panama, has been reporting that the Chinese are starting a road through the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap prevents a lot of migrants from coming to China because it's almost impassable. But with the Chinese, they are going to reconnect South and Central America through the Darien Gap. And if that's the case, that gives migrants a much easier path into the United States. And China is facilitating that.
Gordon, why does it come as no surprise that even the Chinese find the Darien Gap being a place they've got to go through? Gordon Chang, as always, great insight. We shall continue to follow Secretary of State Rubio's trip down there, have you on to comment, and we'll see where it goes. Gordon Chang, thank you very much.